I'm delighted to be with you here. It's Mensah Oteh, and I'm going to be talking to you about equity and debt. Very simple, and I'll keep it as basic as I can, but it's important. If you're thinking about investing, you have to know the difference between equity and debt. Now, I have a slate with me, and I'm going to just quickly write down equity and debt and what the difference is. Now, before I begin, let me make some very basic assumptions. I think every time a lecturer, a teacher, a speaker, a trainer is trying to share thoughts or share an experience or teach, everyone comes from a place of making some basic assumptions. You have to assume some basic things, and I want to share that assumption with you because what I share with you, what I'm about to share through this example, is heavily based on some of my assumptions. Now, the first assumption I'll make is that you have some level of financial intelligence. That's the first. The second assumption I'll make is that you consider financial education to be extremely important to you becoming who you were born to be and also achieving your financial goals. The third assumption I'll make is that you have no personal debts. But even if you do have any personal debts through credit cards, that you pay off your credit cards on a monthly basis and you pay off the full balance. Now, with those three basic assumptions, I can go into equity and debt. Now, the reason I explained those three assumptions was for the primary reason that the word debt is very confusing. It's confusing because most people do not realize that there is something such as what we call investment debt. And this is good debt. And what we call liability debt. And often this is bad debt. Now let me qualify that. Your liability debts are normally your personal debts. So if you go into debt to buy a car, that's bad debt because it's a liability. As a matter of fact, if you buy a brand new car, think about this. If you buy a brand new car, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it loses between 20 and 30% of its value. So automatically you've wiped out 20 or 30% of what you paid for it. That is bad debt because it means the value has declined. So your personal debts are normally what we call liability debts. Your investment debts, on the other hand, will be debts that you get into perhaps for a business, and that is a business that is profitable. So the likes of Coca-Cola, Caterpillar, Facebook, all of the huge companies that you know of, they use debts. Now they make enough revenue, but they understand the value of debt. And so this will be business debts. This will also be investments debt. That is good debt. Now it's important that you understand the difference between both. And part of the reason I say that is simply because until you recognize that there is a huge difference between investment debt and liability debt, until you understand it, you might think that all debts are equal. All debts are not equal. Some will make you rich, some will make you poor. Knowing the difference is important, and that's the reason why I started with the assumption that you have some level of financial intelligence, because some of what I might be sharing with you might sound unreal. It might also sound too good to be true, but also it might be challenging your beliefs, your philosophies, and what you've known for so long. Now, to get wealthy, to become rich, you have to know how to use debt. As a matter of fact, there are two ways to becoming wealthy. The first is you use equity, and equity is where you use all of your resources, where you raise the resources needed for purchasing or for setting up a trade agreement for that particular goal you have or that particular investment you're hoping to obtain. Equity means that you're responsible. You put up your resources, which means that you have a bigger portion of the risk. So let's make it practical. Let's say, for example, let me use an example of mine. I'll give you an example of my first investment. My first real estate investment was a property in London, and the value of the property was for £215,000. This is so many years ago. That's the value of the property. Now, if I was going to use equity investing as my pathway, then it would have meant that I would have had to come up with the full equity to buy that house. So I would have had to come up with 100% of the funds needed. Now, if I came up with £215,000, then I would have been responsible for the entire risks. I wouldn't have shared it with anyone. I wouldn't have needed a mortgage. My mortgage would have been zero. On the other hand, what I did was, because I understood the power of leverage, but also I understood the importance of debt and the disadvantages of equity in some instances, I went to the bank and I said to the bank, I want you to give me 85% or up to 85% of the value of this. The bank agreed and said, okay, we'll give you what you want if you bring 30,000 as equity, and we'll give you 185,000 as equity, as a mortgage. I accepted it completely. Part of the reason I accepted it was because this deal meant that if I took the bank's money, the bank was taking most of the risk. But I had full control and ownership for the property. Obviously, I would have to pay the repayments, but the property was mine technically, and that meant I had all the proceeds from any income generated. The bank wasn't going to share that with me every month. The bank had an expectation of what I had to pay them for the interests, and whatever I made as extra over and above that amount was mine to keep. So I had two options. I had a choice of using equity, or I had a choice of using debt. Now, to come up with this £30,000 that I had and I used as an equity down payment, it took me about 2 or 3 years to save up this amount. So I had to save up what I needed. Now, if it took me 2 or 3 years to generate 30,000, how long do you think it would have taken for me to have raised 215,000? Now, you and I would probably agree that that would have taken me roughly about 7 or 8 years to raise the same amount of money. The question that I have for you is, if it would have taken that long, would it have been smarter to have used equity or to have used debt? Well, the answer is very simple. To start with, I didn't have £215,000, so I couldn't, and that meant that I wouldn't have been able to have purchased the investment. Now, on the other hand, the second thing to bear in mind is this: by purchasing the investment using debt, what that meant was I was able to use other people's money, which is the bank's money in this instance, to get myself going, to get myself on the investment platform and get myself on the pathway towards building wealth. Now, I'll share something else with you from this deal so you can see how interesting it was. 2 years after purchasing this property, everything was going okay. I purchased the property, I rented it out. I now had an income coming in. The income I had coming in was far in excess of the expenses from running the property, which meant that I had a net profit. Now, so the net profit was great because I had an income every month from this investment. But what was even more remarkable was that 2 years after I'd actually made this investment, the value of the investment had gone up from 215 and had gone up to 470. So technically, my net worth had increased by more than £250,000 using debt. Now, remember what I said to you, if I had used equity, to get the £30,000 took me about 2 to 3 years to raise the amount. If I had to raise the 215, it would have taken me almost 7 times as long, which means that this probably would have taken me between 15 and 18 years. I would have been saving. Now, let's just assume, using this example, after 2 to 3 years, I had £30,000, which means if I did the same thing, assume everything worked out well, that in another 2 to 3 years, I would have had £60,000. But because I had used debt, within that 2 to 3 year period, not only did I still have my initial investment, not only was it paying me an income every month, but I now had £250,000 as equity in the investment. And that's the power of debt over equity. Now, you need some level of equity. You need to have some backup equity if you're going to use debt. But more importantly, you need a lot, and I use the word a lot, of financial education and intelligence. And the reason is because although leverage is important and debt helps you achieve more with less, you have to understand that leverage and debt is like a loaded gun. The same way it can protect you is the same way it can actually take your life. So my recommendation is for you not to use debt, whether personal or whether investment, until you've spent a great deal of time studying. Now, my recommendation is that you must spend between 2 and 3 years as a minimum, and between the 2 and 3 year period, you must invest at least 1.5 to 2.5 hours every day, increasing your financial intelligence, studying, researching history, looking at trends, looking at opportunities, reading, studying the lives of the wealthy, modeling their behaviors, their attitude, their actions, their lifestyle, their habits. But you must almost immerse yourself in study for 2 or 3 years as a minimum, and that you must do that every single day. Whilst you're doing this, you will require a lot of analysis of deals, investment options, investment vehicles. You must study a lot of planning and management. And once you've done that, then you would have equipped yourself with some level of understanding about what you're trying to get into. And I say this simply because although my very first, when I began my real estate journey, my very first investment was a £250,000 property, I could have gone for more. I could have. Who knows, maybe I could have got a value of a property for, £250,000, or, who knows, even £1 million. I could have. The problem was my knowledge and my experience with debt was so low. So I had to caution myself and discipline myself to start small. I couldn't start from 1 million because I had not developed the self-concept. I had not developed the stamina. I had not developed the level of vocabulary, understanding, knowledge, and most importantly, wisdom to be able to manage that level of responsibility. So I started small. And every year since then, I've been increasing my knowledge, and for that reason, I keep going down and looking for more. But the recommendation is never use debt more than what you understand. Always keep the level of debt you go for in proportion with your financial wisdom. So, to summarize, I would say this. If you want to get wealthy, if you want to get rich, then understand that the rich use other people's money to get rich, and that is leverage. And leverage comes in many forms. The best form is the leverage of money, using other people's money, but also the leverage of time, using other people's time and resources. If you can discipline yourself to start committing some time to study, so that this concept will start to become very, very easy to understand, and what you'll find is that very quickly you can start to rewrite your financial future and rewrite history. I believe that history has been written, but also history is being written today. And you can choose the legacy you leave behind through the decisions you make. And I hope that in the last few minutes that I presented you with some information to enable you make a different decision for the future, and hopefully that would help you become the best that you can be. God bless.